I never thought I'd be sitting in a coffee shop in Portland, staring at a chipped mug and trying to figure out if I'd just ruined my entire life for something that felt like a dream. My name is Claire. I'm 34 years old, and 6 months ago I walked into a dusty old music studio for what I thought was just another piano lesson. I didn't know that my 80-year-old teacher would change the trajectory of everything I'd ever believed about love, loyalty, and the quiet prisons we build for ourselves. I didn't know I'd end up here in this cold metal chair with my hands shaking so hard I can barely hold the cup, replaying every single note that led me to this point. It all started on a Tuesday, which seems so stupidly ordinary now. Tuesdays were my day, the one afternoon I carved out of the chaos of being a mother, a wife, a daughter, a friend, a whole constellation of roles that left no room for just Claire. I'd been playing piano since I was 6, but somewhere between my first job and my second kid, the music stopped being mine. It became background noise, a skill I trotted out at holidays to impress my in-laws, a ghost of something I used to love. When my husband Mark suggested I take lessons again as a birthday gift, I thought he was being sweet. He was always sweet, that was the problem, really. He was so sweet, so reliably, predictably, agonizingly sweet that I had started to feel like I was drowning in honey. Mark and I had been together for 12 years, married for 9. We met in college, in a stale dorm hallway where he was trying to fix a broken printer and I was just trying to get my essay printed. He was tall and awkward, with glasses that were always slipping down his nose, and he talked to me like I was the only person in the world who mattered. He never stopped talking to me like that. Even after 2 kids, even after a mortgage, even after we'd settled into the kind of routine where we could finish each other's sentences and predict each other's moods, he still looked at me like I was something precious. But precious things get put on shelves, don't they? They get admired from a distance, dusted off once in a while, but never really touched. I was his precious wife, his perfect mother, his stable anchor, and somewhere along the way I stopped being a woman. I stopped being passionate, stopped being messy, stopped being the girl who used to stay up all night writing songs about heartbreak she'd never even felt. I'd become a character in a story I didn't write, and the role was suffocating me. The studio was in an old brick building downtown, the kind of place that smelled like wood polish and forgotten dreams. It was tucked between a vegan bakery and a vintage clothing store, and I almost walked past it because the sign was so faded you could barely read the name, Manfred's Music. I had to climb a narrow flight of stairs that creaked with every step, and when I finally reached the door at the top, I hesitated. I'd seen pictures of Manfred on his website, which looked like it had been designed in 1999. He was old, obviously, with a wild shock of white hair and glasses so thick they made his eyes look huge. I expected him to be frail, gentle, maybe a little forgetful. I was completely wrong. He opened the door before I could knock, and the first thing I noticed was his energy. He was 80, but he moved like a man half his age, brisk and purposeful, with a handshake that was firm enough to leave my fingers tingling. He didn't smile. He just studied me, his head tilted as if he was trying to read the music of my soul through my posture alone. "You're late," he said. It wasn't accusatory, just a statement of fact. I glanced at my watch. I was 2 minutes late. "I'm sorry," I stammered, already feeling like a child caught sneaking out of class. "Traffic was..." He waved a hand dismissively. "Time is just a construct, Claire, but we only have 58 minutes left. Let's not waste them." He turned and walked into the room, leaving me to follow, and God, the room. It was packed with instruments. Not just pianos, but violins, cellos, a dusty harp in the corner, sheet music piled high on every surface like snowdrifts. The walls were covered in photographs, black and white portraits of musicians I didn't recognize, all of them looking serious and slightly haunted. The centerpiece was a grand piano, a Steinway that gleamed under the soft yellow light of a floor lamp. It looked ancient and expensive and terrifying. "Don't just stand there," Manfred said, settling onto the bench with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime there. "Play something for me." I felt my palms start to sweat. I hadn't played for anyone in years, not really. The kids would bang on the keys, Mark would hum along from the kitchen, but that wasn't performing, that was just noise. But Manfred was watching me with those huge magnified eyes, and I suddenly felt like I couldn't breathe. I sat down next to him, careful to keep space between us, and placed my hands on the keys. I played Chopin. It was safe, classical, technically sound. I played it exactly the way I'd been taught as a teenager, precise and proper, and I was proud of myself for remembering all the notes. But when I finished, silence stretched between us like a chasm. Manfred didn't clap, he didn't say good job, he just stared at the keys for a long moment, and then he said the words that would haunt me for months. "You play like you're trying to be invisible, like you're afraid that if anyone hears you, they'll see who you really are." I wanted to be offended. I wanted to gather my purse and storm out and never come back. But instead, I felt the sting of tears behind my eyes because he was right. He was absolutely, devastatingly right. I'd spent my whole life learning how to disappear, how to make myself small and convenient and easy to love. I played the perfect notes so no one would notice that I was screaming inside. Manfred leaned over and placed his gnarled hand over mine on the keys. His skin was papery and thin, but his touch was warm. "We're not going to do that here," he said softly. "We're going to make mistakes. We're going to play loudly and badly and with feeling. You're going to stop hiding, Claire, because music is the only truth we have left." I didn't know it then, but that moment was a doorway. I walked through it willingly, desperately, and I didn't look back. Over the next few weeks, I started to change in ways that were subtle at first, then undeniable. I found myself thinking about my lessons constantly, not just the music but the conversations. Manfred didn't just teach me piano, he taught me how to feel again. He'd play a chord and ask me what it tasted like, and I'd laugh at the absurdity of the question, but then I'd really think about it and say dark chocolate or rain or a memory I don't have. He challenged me to improvise, to just let my fingers wander across the keys and see what came out, and what came out was a river of emotion I'd been damming up for years. I started coming home after each lesson feeling raw and exposed, but also alive. Mark noticed. Of course he did. He wasn't stupid, just willfully oblivious sometimes. One night after I'd put the kids to bed and we were both lying in the dark, he rolled over and propped himself up on his elbow. "You seem different lately," he said. There was a note of concern in his voice, not jealousy, not yet, just a husband trying to figure out if his wife was okay. "Different how?" I asked, keeping my voice light. "I don't know, happier, more present." He paused. "And you're playing that old record all the time now. The one with the crackling." It was a recording Manfred had given me, a live performance of a jazz pianist I'd never heard of, someone who played like their heart was being broken and mended all at once. I played it in the car while I cooked dinner, while I took showers. I was obsessed. "It's just music," I said, and I turned away from him, pulling the covers up. But it wasn't just music, it was a lifeline. The relationship between Manfred and me was a strange one. At first, I thought of him as a mentor, almost a grandfather figure. He was 80, for God's sake. He'd been playing since before my parents were born. He traveled the world, performed in concert halls that were now just pictures in history books. He'd been married twice and divorced once, and his children rarely visited him. He was full of stories, some funny, some bitter, all of them delivered in that clipped, no-nonsense tone. But as the weeks passed, I started to see him differently. I noticed the way his hands moved on the keys, how expressive they were despite his age. I noticed the way his voice softened when he talked about certain pieces of music, as if they were old lovers he'd never quite gotten over. I noticed the intensity in his eyes when he watched me play, the way he was always pushing me further, deeper, harder, and I was craving that push like a drug. It was a gray afternoon in late October when it happened. The rain was coming down in sheets and I'd had a terrible day. My daughter Sophie had gotten into trouble at school for fighting, and my son Leo had thrown up all over my new blazer right as I was rushing out the door. Mark was working late, as usual, and I felt like the weight of everything was cracking me open. I showed up at Manfred's studio and I didn't even bother with pleasantries. I just sat down at the piano, placed my hands on the keys, and I played. I didn't play anything I'd practiced. I played the frustration and the exhaustion and the loneliness. I played the part of me that was so tired of being perfect. I played for myself, and it was ugly and loud, and I didn't stop until my fingers were aching and tears were streaming down my face. Manfred didn't say a word. He just sat next to me, and after the last note faded, he reached over and wiped a tear from my cheek with his thumb. It was the most tender gesture I'd received in years, and it shattered something inside me. I leaned into him, not as a student, not as a granddaughter, but as a woman. I felt his breath catch, and for a moment neither of us moved. The rain kept falling, pounding against the old windows like it was trying to get in. I heard my own heartbeat, loud and frantic, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was about to cross a line I'd never be able to uncross. "Claire," he said, and his voice was rough, not the steady teacher's voice I was used to. "You have a husband, you have a family." I pulled back and looked at him. His face was full of conflict, and for the first time I saw him as a man, not an old man. I saw the loneliness in his eyes, the years of playing beautiful music for empty halls, the love he'd given and lost and never truly replaced. I saw something I recognized in myself. "I know," I whispered, "but I'm so tired of being what everyone else wants me to be." And then, in a moment that felt both inevitable and impossible, he leaned in and kissed me. It was gentle at first, almost tentative, like he was waiting for me to stop him. But I didn't stop him. I kissed him back, and it felt like the first real thing I'd done in years. I can't tell you exactly what happened after that. The memory is a blur of rain and music and the creak of the old floorboards. What I can tell you is that I didn't go home that night until after midnight. I made up a story about getting stuck at the studio because of the storm, and Mark believed me because why wouldn't he? He trusted me implicitly, and that trust was a knife I was twisting deeper every second. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, and I couldn't stop replaying it. The smell of his old cologne, the feel of his hand on my back, the way he'd whispered my name like it was a prayer. I felt guilty and exhilarated and more alive than I'd felt in a decade. And I knew with a sinking certainty that I was already in too deep to turn back. The weeks that followed were a strange, feverish dream. I walked through my life like an actress in a play I no longer believed in, smiling at Mark across the breakfast table, packing lunches for Sophie and Leo, folding laundry that smelled like fabric softener and routine. But underneath the surface of that perfect domestic picture, I was churning. Every spare moment I had, I found myself thinking about Manfred. Not just the physical memory of that first kiss, which I replayed obsessively in my head, but the way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. He looked at me and he didn't see a mother or a wife or a woman who had to have dinner on the table by 6. He saw Claire, the girl who played Chopin like she was trying to disappear, the woman who had so much rage and passion bottled up inside her that it was poisoning her from the inside out. He saw me and he wasn't afraid of what he found. Our lessons became a dangerous game. I'd show up at the studio and we'd pretend for the first 15 minutes that everything was normal. I'd play scales, he'd correct my posture, we'd talk about phrasing and dynamics. But there was always this electric tension in the air, a current that crackled between us as we sat side by side on that worn piano bench. And eventually, inevitably, the pretense would fall away. He'd reach for my hand, or I'd rest my head on his shoulder, and the conversation would shift from music to something deeper, something more dangerous. We talked about his late wife, Alina, who had died of cancer 20 years ago. He told me how she used to sing while he played, how her voice was the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard, and how he'd never been able to play certain songs since she passed because they reminded him too much of her. I told him about my childhood, how my parents had divorced when I was 12, and I'd spent the rest of my teenage years trying to be perfect so my mother wouldn't leave too. I told him about Mark, how I loved him but sometimes I felt like I was drowning in the sameness of our life, the way we'd become roommates who shared a bed and a mortgage but not much else. I told him things I'd never told anyone, not even my closest friends, and he listened without judgment. He just held my hand and nodded and told me that I was brave, braver than I knew, and that the fact that I could feel so deeply was a gift, not a curse. The physical intimacy escalated slowly, then all at once. It was never just about sex, although that was part of it. It was about the intimacy of being completely naked in every sense of the word in front of another person. He was old and his body was marked by the years, but I didn't care. I didn't see the wrinkles or the frailty. I saw the way his eyes lit up when I walked into the room. I saw the way his hands, which were so steady on the keys, trembled slightly when he touched my face. I saw a man who had spent his entire life giving himself to music and had been left in his final years with nothing but memories. And I, in turn, saw myself as a woman who had spent her entire life giving herself to everyone else and had been left with nothing but a hollow ache in her chest. We filled that ache for each other, even if it was just for a few hours a week in that dusty studio with the rain-streaked windows. I started lying to Mark with an ease that terrified me. I told him I was working late, that I was meeting a friend for drinks, that I was taking extra lessons because I had a recital coming up. The recital part was technically true. Manfred and I had started planning a small performance, a duet, just for the other students at the studio. But that was just a cover, a convenient excuse to spend more time with him. I could see the worry creeping into Mark's eyes, the way he'd watch me as I got ready to leave, the subtle questions he'd ask about my day. He wasn't accusatory, he never was. He was just confused, trying to understand why his wife, who used to be so predictable, had suddenly become so distant and secretive. One night, he cornered me in the kitchen while I was washing dishes. The kids were in bed and the house was quiet. "Claire," he said, and his voice had that careful tone he used when he was trying not to upset me. "Can we talk?" I turned off the faucet and dried my hands, my heart already pounding. "Sure, honey." "What's up?" He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest. He was still handsome, Mark, in that clean-cut, all-American way. He had kind eyes and a steady job, and he'd never raised his voice at me once in our entire marriage. He was a good man, a genuinely good man, and that made what I was doing so much worse. "I feel like I'm losing you," he said, and the vulnerability in his voice hit me like a punch to the gut. "You're always gone, and when you're here, you're somewhere else. Your head is somewhere else. I try to talk to you and you give me one-word answers. I try to touch you and you flinch away." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "Are you having an affair?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy and accusing. I wanted to say no. I wanted to look him in the eye and tell him he was crazy, that I would never do that to him, that he was being paranoid. But the truth was burning a hole in my throat and I couldn't force the lie out, so I did the next best thing. I deflected. "How can you even ask me that? I said, my voice rising with fake indignation. I'm just trying to find something for myself, Mark. I'm trying to remember who I am outside of being a mother and a wife. Is that so wrong? He stared at me, his expression unreadable. No, he said quietly, it's not wrong, but it's not what I asked. I turned away from him, grabbing a dish towel and wiping the same spot on the counter over and over again. I'm not having an affair, I said, and it tasted like ash in my mouth. I just need some space, okay? I need to figure things out. I could feel his eyes on my back, and I knew he didn't believe me, but I also knew he wouldn't push. He never pushed. He was too afraid of losing me to risk a real fight, and I was counting on that. The guilt was a constant companion, a low hum in the background of every moment. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with images of Mark's face if he ever found out flashing through my mind. I'd look at my children, their innocent little faces, and I'd feel like I was betraying them too, not just their father but the very idea of the family we'd built together. But then I'd see Manfred, and all that guilt would fade into the background, replaced by a desperate, consuming need. He was like a drug, and I was hopelessly addicted. I started to rationalize it, to twist the narrative in my head until I was the victim and my affair was a rebellion, not a betrayal. I told myself that Mark had neglected me emotionally, that he'd taken me for granted, that he'd stopped seeing me as a woman and started seeing me as a fixture. I told myself that I deserved to be happy, that I deserved to feel passion, that I'd given so much of myself to everyone else and it was time to be selfish. It was a fragile web of self-deception, and I clung to it desperately because the alternative was facing the horrifying truth. I was a liar and a cheater, and I was destroying the life I'd built for a man who was old enough to be my grandfather. Manfred and I never talked about the future. We lived in a bubble, insulated from the real world by the walls of that studio and the music we made together. He never asked me to leave Mark, and I never offered. It was an unspoken agreement between us, a way to preserve the fantasy without having to confront the messy reality outside. But as the holidays approached, the bubble started to feel more and more fragile. Thanksgiving was a nightmare of forced smiles and small talk with Mark's family, who kept asking me why I looked so tired and why I wasn't drinking the wine they'd brought. I spent most of the day hiding in the kitchen, pretending to be busy, while Mark's mother watched me with narrowed eyes. She was a sharp woman, his mother, and I could tell she sensed something was off. She cornered me while I was peeling potatoes. You know, she said in that casually cruel way of hers, Mark has always been so devoted to you. I hope you appreciate him. I smiled and said of course I did, but my hands were shaking as I gripped the peeler. The duet recital was scheduled for the first week of December. We'd been practicing for weeks, a piece by Rachmaninoff that was so difficult I had to practice for hours just to get the notes right. But the challenge was exhilarating. For the first time in my life, I was performing for an audience that actually mattered, not my in-laws or my friends from college, but other musicians, people who understood what it meant to pour your soul into a piece of music. Manfred and I were going to play together, side by side, and I was nervous in a way I hadn't been since my first piano recital as a child. The night of the recital, I told Mark I was going out with some friends for a holiday dinner. I hated myself for the lie, but I'd gotten too good at it. I dressed up in a deep red dress that I'd bought specifically for the occasion, a dress that made me feel beautiful and powerful and dangerously alive. I did my hair and makeup with care, and when Mark saw me before I left, he stopped in his tracks. Wow, he said, and his voice was filled with a kind of sad admiration. You look amazing. I've missed seeing you like this. I wanted to hug him, to apologize, to stay home and watch a movie with him and pretend that I'd never met Manfred. But I couldn't. I was already too far gone. The recital was held in a small, elegant hall at the university. The audience was mostly other students and their families, but the room was packed and the energy was electric. I stood backstage with Manfred, my hands clammy with nerves, and he reached out and took them in his. You're going to be wonderful, he said, and his voice was calm and steady. Just remember to breathe, remember to feel the music. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. And then we were walking out onto the stage, the lights blinding, the murmur of the audience fading to a hush. We sat down at the piano and I looked at him, this old man with his wild white hair and his wrinkled hands, and I felt a surge of love so powerful it almost knocked me over. Not just physical love, not just romantic love, but a deep, profound connection that transcended all of it. I placed my hands on the keys and we began to play. The music was transcendent. We played as one, our fingers moving in perfect synchrony, the notes weaving together into something that was greater than the sum of its parts. I forgot about the audience. I forgot about Mark. I forgot about the lies and the guilt and the fear. I was just the music, pure and simple, and Manfred was right there with me, our souls intertwined in the melody. When we finished, the silence stretched for a moment and then the applause exploded. It was thunderous, enthusiastic, and I felt tears streaming down my face. I looked at Manfred and he was smiling, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up his old face. We stood up and bowed, and I felt like I was floating. In that moment, I was invincible. I was Claire, the pianist, the artist, the woman who had finally found her voice. But the high didn't last. We went backstage and the spell was broken. The real world came crashing back in, and with it came the crushing weight of everything I was doing. Manfred was quiet as he gathered his things, and I could feel the distance growing between us again. "You should go home," he said, not meeting my eyes. "It's late, your family will be waiting." I wanted to argue, to cling to him, to beg him to take me away from all of this, but he was right. I had to go home. I had to go back to my life, to my husband and my children, in the beautiful, suffocating prison I'd built for myself. I kissed him goodbye, a quick hollow kiss, and then I walked out into the cold December night, my breath fogging in the air, and I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and frozen tears. I walked into the house and Mark was waiting up for me, sitting on the couch with a book in his hand. He looked tired, and I saw the flash of hurt in his eyes when he saw the red dress, the careful makeup, the look on my face that I couldn't quite hide. "How was dinner?" he asked, and his voice was flat. "It was fine," I said, dropping my purse on the floor. "I'm exhausted. I'm going to bed." I walked past him and I felt his hand close around my wrist, stopping me. "Claire," he said, and his voice cracked. "Please, just tell me the truth. Whatever it is, I can handle it." I turned to look at him, and in his eyes I saw not anger, not accusation, but fear, deep, primal fear. He was terrified of losing me, and I had just proven that his fear was justified. I opened my mouth to say something, to apologize, to confess, but the words wouldn't come. All I could see was Manfred's face, the way he'd smiled at me on that stage, the way he'd made me feel like I was finally, truly alive. I pulled my hand away from Mark's grip. "There's nothing to tell," I said, and I walked up the stairs, leaving him sitting alone in the dark living room, his whole world crumbling around him. The winter that followed was the coldest I'd ever felt, and it had nothing to do with the weather. Portland became a city of gray skies and endless rain, and I moved through it like a ghost, haunting the spaces I used to inhabit with warmth and purpose. The holidays were a blur of obligation, a series of performances I gave for my family while my heart was somewhere else entirely. I cooked Christmas dinner, I wrapped presents, I smiled for photographs, and all the while I was counting the hours until I could see Manfred again. But something had shifted between us after the recital. He was more distant, more cautious, and I could feel him pulling away even as I clung tighter. It was like trying to hold onto smoke, and the desperation I felt was starting to consume me. I started taking risks that I never would have dreamed of a few months ago. I'd skip family dinners to meet him at the studio, claiming work emergencies or last-minute deadlines. I'd lie to my friends, my neighbors, anyone who asked. I even lied to my own mother, who called me one afternoon and asked why I sounded so distant. "I'm just tired, Mom," I said, staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. "The kids are exhausting, and Mark's been working so much." She told me to take care of myself, to rest more, to stop trying to be Superwoman. She had no idea how close to the truth she was. I was trying to be two women at once, the devoted wife and mother and the passionate lover, and the strain was beginning to show in ways I couldn't hide. My skin was pale, my eyes hollow, and I'd lost weight I didn't have to lose. Mark noticed, of course. He noticed everything, even when he pretended not to. New Year's Eve was the breaking point. We'd been invited to a party at our friend's house, a big celebration with champagne and noisemakers and the kind of forced cheerfulness that always made me feel claustrophobic. I told Mark I didn't want to go, that I had a headache, that I just wanted to stay home and sleep. He looked at me with those sad, knowing eyes, and for a moment I thought he was going to push back, but he just shrugged and said, "Fine, I'll take the kids, you rest." He said it like he was talking to a stranger, and that coldness cut deeper than any accusation could have. I watched him bundle Sophie and Leo into their winter coats, watched them wave goodbye as they disappeared into the cold night, and when the door clicked shut behind them, I was alone. The house was silent, and I sat on the couch in the dark, staring at the twinkling lights on the Christmas tree, and I felt the full weight of my isolation pressing down on me. I called Manfred. I didn't even think about it. My fingers dialed his number before my brain could catch up, and when he answered, his voice was a lifeline in the darkness. "Claire," he said, and it wasn't a question. He knew it was me. "I need to see you," I said, and my voice was breaking. "I need to see you tonight, please." There was a long pause on the other end, and I could hear him breathing, could hear the weight of his own loneliness in the silence. Finally, he sighed. "I'll be here," he said. "I'll be waiting." The studio was dark when I arrived, lit only by a single lamp in the corner. Manfred was sitting at the piano, not playing, just staring at the keys like he was trying to read the future in them. He looked older than I remembered, frailer, as if the weight of our secret was aging him by the day. I crossed the room and knelt in front of him, taking his hands in mine. "I can't do this anymore," I said, and I meant it, even though I didn't know which this I was talking about. I can't keep living two lives, it's tearing me apart. He looked at me and there was such profound sadness in his eyes that it made my chest ache. You think I don't know that, he said softly. You think I don't feel it too. Every time you walk out that door, I feel like I'm losing a piece of myself. But Claire, you have to understand, this was never going to last. It was never meant to be anything more than what it is. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. No, I said, my voice fierce. Don't say that, don't you dare say that. You're the only thing that makes sense anymore. And then I kissed him and we were lost again. We made love on the floor of the studio, surrounded by sheet music and the ghosts of forgotten musicians. And for a few hours, I didn't think about Mark or the kids or the life I was destroying. I only thought about the warmth of Manfred's body against mine, the sound of his breathing, the way he held me like I was something precious. When it was over, we lay in the dark, tangled together, and he stroked my hair with a tenderness that broke my heart. You have to go home, he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. I know, I said, just a few more minutes and then I'll be fine. It was a lie and we both knew it. I would never be fine again. I got home just before midnight. The house was still empty, and I poured myself a glass of wine and sat alone watching the ball drop on TV. When the clock struck 12, I toasted the air, a hollow gesture to a new year I didn't want. Mark came home with the kids around one, their cheeks flushed with cold and excitement. Sophie ran to me, chattering about the fireworks and the sparkling cider, and I hugged her tight, breathing in the scent of her hair. Leo was asleep in Mark's arms, and Mark looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Happy New Year, he said, and his voice was flat. Happy New Year, I replied, and we stood there in the foyer, two strangers bound by the weight of a decade, and I knew that something had broken between us that night. Something that couldn't be fixed. The next few weeks were a slow, agonizing descent. Mark stopped asking questions. He stopped trying to touch me, stopped trying to talk to me. He withdrew into himself, and the silence in our house became a tangible thing, pressing down on us from every angle. I told myself it was better this way, that the distance made it easier to do what I had to do. But the truth was, I missed him. I missed the Mark I used to know, the one who made me laugh and held my hand and looked at me like I was the center of his universe. I missed the comfort of routine, the predictability of our life. I missed being a wife, even a bored one, because at least it meant I belonged somewhere. But I couldn't go back. I was already too deep in the other world, the one where I was Claire the lover, Claire the artist, Claire the woman who wasn't defined by anyone but herself. And that woman was selfish and desperate and unwilling to let go of the only thing that made her feel alive. So I kept seeing Manfred, kept lying, kept pretending that I could have both lives without losing everything. I was wrong, and I was about to find out just how wrong I was. It was a Thursday afternoon, cold and gray, when Mark followed me. I didn't notice him at first, didn't see the car tailing me through the streets of Portland. I was too lost in my own head, too focused on the drive to the studio, too eager to see Manfred again. I parked in my usual spot and I walked up the creaky stairs and I didn't look back. I walked into the studio and Manfred was there, and I closed the door behind me and I ran into his arms. I told him I loved him because I did, with all the desperate, broken parts of me. He told me he loved me too, and we stood there holding each other, and for a moment everything was perfect. And then the door opened. Mark was standing in the doorway, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. He looked at me, then at Manfred, then back at me, and the betrayal in his eyes was so raw, so visceral, that I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. Oh my God, he whispered, and his voice was barely audible. Oh my God, Claire, what have you done? I let go of Manfred, stumbling backwards like I'd been burned. Mark, I said, my voice shaking. Mark, I can explain. But I couldn't explain. There was no explanation for what he'd just seen. There was no excuse for the months of lying, the weeks of deceit, the way I'd destroyed our marriage for a man who was old enough to be my grandfather. Mark just stood there staring at us, and I saw the moment his heart shattered. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion, brick by brick, until there was nothing left but rubble. I knew it, he said, and his voice was hollow. I knew it, but I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to believe that you could do this to me, to us. He took a step back, shaking his head. I trusted you, Claire, I trusted you with everything, and you threw it away, you threw it all away. And then he turned and walked out the door, leaving me standing in the middle of the studio, my world crumbling around me. I didn't follow him. I couldn't. I was frozen, rooted to the spot, unable to move or speak or even breathe. Manfred was saying something, but I couldn't hear him over the roaring in my ears. All I could see was Mark's face, the way it had crumpled with pain, the way he'd looked at me like I was a stranger. And all I could feel was the crushing weight of everything I'd lost, everything I'd thrown away, all for a few stolen moments of passion. I sank to my knees on the floor, the tears coming so fast I couldn't see, and I screamed. I screamed until my throat was raw, until I couldn't scream anymore, until all that was left was a hollow, aching silence. Manfred knelt beside me, his hands on my shoulders, but I pushed him away. I couldn't bear to touch him, couldn't bear to look at him. He was a reminder of everything I'd done wrong, and I hated him for it. I hated myself more. I don't remember leaving the studio. I don't remember the drive home or the way the rain must have been falling or the cold that seeped into my bones as I sat in the driveway for what felt like hours. What I remember is walking through the front door of my house and finding it empty. The kids were at school, Mark was at work, and I was alone with the silence and the wreckage of my life. I walked from room to room, touching things, trying to ground myself in the familiar. Sophie's backpack was hanging on the hook by the door, her pink jacket crumpled on the floor where she dropped it. Leo's toys were scattered across the living room rug, a half-eaten granola bar on the coffee table. The house looked exactly the same as it had that morning, but everything had changed. The walls felt thinner, the light dimmer, the air heavier. I sat down on the couch, the same couch where Mark and I had spent countless nights watching movies and talking about our dreams, and I buried my face in my hands and sobbed. The phone rang at 3 o'clock. It was Mark, and when I answered, his voice was cold, clinical, like he was talking to a business associate instead of his wife of nearly a decade. "I'm not coming home tonight," he said. "I'm staying at a hotel, I need to think." I opened my mouth to say something, to apologize, to beg him to come home so we could talk, but the words wouldn't come. I just sat there, silent, listening to the hollow sound of his breathing on the other end. "Claire," he said finally, and there was a crack in his voice, a tiny fissure in the wall he'd built around himself. "How long?" I closed my eyes, the tears spilling down my cheeks. "I don't know," I whispered. "A few months, maybe longer." He let out a shaky breath, and I could hear the pain in it, the raw, jagged pain of a man who had just had his heart ripped out. "I need you to listen to me," he said, and his voice was steady again, controlled. "I need you to stay away from me, from the kids. I need you to give me space. Do you understand?" I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Yes," I said, "I understand." And then he hung up, and I was alone again, drowning in the silence of the house that was no longer a home. The next few days were a blur of nothing. I called in sick to work, even though I was a freelance graphic designer and could have worked from home. I just couldn't focus. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't do anything but stare at the walls and replay every moment of the past few months in my head. I thought about Mark, about the way he'd looked at me in that doorway, the betrayal etched into every line of his face. I thought about Sophie and Leo, their innocent little faces, and I wondered how I was ever going to look them in the eye again. I thought about Manfred, and the guilt was so overwhelming I felt like I was suffocating. He called me over and over, but I didn't answer. I couldn't. Every time my phone buzzed, I felt a wave of nausea, a reminder of everything I'd done and everything I'd lost. Mark came back on Sunday. He walked into the house while I was sitting in the kitchen, drinking cold coffee and staring at nothing. He looked terrible, his eyes red-rimmed, his face haggard like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there in the doorway looking at me like I was a stranger. Then he sat down across from me at the table, and we faced each other across the chasm of 12 years. "I talked to a lawyer," he said, and the words hit me like a physical blow. "I'm going to file for divorce." I opened my mouth to protest, to tell him that we could fix this, that we could go to counseling, that I would do anything to make it right. But the look on his face stopped me. It was a look of finality, of resignation, of a man who had already mourned the marriage and was now just going through the motions of burying it. "I'm not going to make this ugly," he continued, his voice flat. "I'm not going to drag you through the mud in court. I just want you out of the house. I want the kids to have some stability, and I can't give them that with you here." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "You can have the studio, the equipment, whatever you need to keep working. I'll pay for it. I need you to go." I nodded because I couldn't speak. The tears were streaming down my face, but I didn't wipe them away. I let them fall, let them pool on the table in front of me because they were the only honest thing I had left. "I'm sorry," I said, and my voice was a broken whisper. "I'm so sorry, Mark. I never meant to hurt you." He looked at me, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the man I'd married, the kind, gentle man who had loved me with all his heart. But then it was gone, replaced by the cold, distant stranger sitting across from me. "I know," he said. "I know you didn't mean to, but you did, and I can't live with that." He stood up, pushing his chair back with a scrape against the floor. "I'll give you a few days to pack, take whatever you need. I'll have the papers drawn up by the end of the week." And then he walked out of the kitchen, out of my life, and I was left alone with the cold coffee and the hollow echo of my own despair. I moved out 3 days later. I found a small apartment on the other side of town, a cramped one-bedroom with peeling wallpaper and a view of a parking lot. It was cheap and depressing, and it smelled like stale cigarettes, but it was mine, and that was the only thing that mattered. I packed a few suitcases with clothes and books and the photographs I couldn't bear to leave behind. I left everything else, the furniture, the dishes, the Christmas ornaments we'd collected over the years. I didn't want any of it. I didn't want the reminders of a life I'd thrown away. I said goodbye to Sophie and Leo at the house, and it was the hardest thing I've ever done. Sophie cried, clinging to my leg, begging me not to go. Leo just stood there, silent and confused, his little face a mask of bewilderment. Mark stood behind them, his hand on Sophie's shoulder, and the look in his eyes was one of pity, not anger. I hated that look more than anything. Manfred was waiting for me at the studio when I arrived with my suitcases. I hadn't told him I was coming, but he seemed to know. He was sitting at the piano, playing something soft and sad, and when I walked in, he stopped and looked at me. There was no judgment in his eyes, no accusation, just a deep, aching sorrow. "Claire," he said, and his voice was gentle. "I'm so sorry." I dropped my bags on the floor and walked over to him, collapsing into his arms like a child. We stood there, holding each other, and I cried until I had no tears left. "What do I do now?" I asked, my voice muffled against his chest. "What do I do with the rest of my life?" He was quiet for a long moment, stroking my hair, and when he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with regret. "You keep living," he said. "You keep playing, you keep moving forward one day at a time. That's all any of us can do." But it wasn't that simple. The weeks that followed were a spiral of darkness. I tried to throw myself into my work, to lose myself in the music like I used to, but nothing helped. The studio, which had once been my sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. Every note I played reminded me of Manfred, of what we'd done, of what I'd lost. I started drinking, just a glass of wine at first, then 2, then 3. I'd sit in my new apartment, staring at the blank walls, and I'd drink until the numbness set in. I stopped answering my phone, stopped checking my email, stopped caring about anything. My friends called, my mother called, even Mark called a few times to check on me, but I let them all go to voicemail. I was drowning and I didn't want to be saved. Manfred tried to save me. He'd come to my apartment with groceries, with sheet music, with gentle words of encouragement. But I pushed him away again and again. I was angry, so angry, not at him but at myself, and I took it out on him in every way I could. I told him I hated him, that I wished I'd never met him, that he'd ruined my life. I said things I didn't mean, cruel, cutting things, and each time I saw the hurt in his eyes, I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. It was easier to blame him than to face the truth. I had done this to myself. I had made the choices. I had set the fire, and now I was just standing in the ashes, waiting for the smoke to clear. One night in late February, I hit rock bottom. I was sitting on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by empty wine bottles and crumpled tissues, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd eaten a real meal. My phone was buzzing on the table, Manfred's name flashing on the screen, but I ignored it. I was too tired to move, too tired to care. I closed my eyes and I let the darkness wash over me, and I thought about how easy it would be to just let go, to stop fighting, to disappear into the void and never come back. I was on the edge, teetering, and I didn't know if I wanted to fall. But then I heard a knock on the door, not Manfred's knock, which was always soft and hesitant, but a sharp, insistent pounding. I dragged myself to my feet and opened the door, and there was Mark standing in the hallway with a look of desperate worry on his face. "I've been calling you," he said, pushing past me into the apartment. "You haven't answered in 3 days." I was starting to think. He stopped, looking around at the mess, the bottles, the chaos, and his expression softened. "Oh, Claire," he said, and there was such sadness in his voice. "Oh, Claire, what have you done to yourself?" I broke down then, sobbing in his arms, and he held me like he used to, like I was something worth holding. "I can't do this," I said, my voice breaking. "I can't live with what I did. I can't live with myself." He was quiet for a long moment, just holding me, and then he said the words that changed everything. "I know," he said softly, "I know it hurts, but you have to keep going, for Sophie. For Leo, for yourself. You can't let this destroy you." I pulled back, looking at him through tear-blurred eyes. "Why are you here?" I asked. "Why do you care what happens to me?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because I made a vow," he said, "for better or worse. I know it doesn't mean anything anymore, not after what you did. But I still care about you, Claire. I still want you to be okay." He looked at me and there was no anger in his eyes, just a tired resignation. "I'm not going to let you destroy yourself, not if I can help it." He stayed with me that night and the next and the next. He didn't move back in, didn't promise to forgive me, didn't give me any false hope. But he was there, a steady presence, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone. He made sure I ate, made sure I showered, made sure I got out of bed. He talked to me about the kids, about their progress in school, about the little things they said and did. He told me stories, mundane stories about his day, his work, his life, and I listened, and slowly, painfully, I started to feel like a person again. The divorce papers came in March. I signed them without reading them, tears streaming down my face. The legal separation was finalized, the custody arrangement was set, and I was officially no longer a wife. I was just Claire, a single woman with 2 children and a shattered heart, trying to piece together the fragments of a life that no longer made sense. Manfred heard about the divorce, of course. He came to my apartment one afternoon, his face pale, his hands trembling. "I'm sorry," he said, and he looked so old, so fragile that my heart ached. "I'm so sorry, Claire. I never wanted this for you. I never wanted you to lose everything." I looked at him, this man who had been my salvation and my ruin, and I felt a strange sense of peace. "It's not your fault," I said, and for the first time I meant it. It was my choice, my responsibility. I have to live with it now. He nodded, a single tear sliding down his wrinkled cheek. "What happens now?" he asked. I looked out the window at the gray Portland sky and I thought about the future, uncertain and terrifying and full of possibility. "I don't know," I said, "but I'm going to find out." The months that followed were a slow, painful climb back to the surface. I started going to therapy, a support group for people who had experienced betrayal, both as the betrayer and the betrayed. I listened to stories of broken trust and shattered hearts, and I realized that I wasn't alone. I wasn't a monster. I was a flawed human being who had made terrible mistakes, and the only way forward was to accept that and try to be better. I started playing piano again, but not the way I used to. I played for myself, not for Manfred, not for anyone else. I played the music of my own healing, the notes of my own redemption. It was slow and painful and beautiful, and it reminded me of who I was before all of this. It reminded me of the girl I used to be, the one who dreamed of playing in concert halls and writing songs and living a life full of passion. That girl was still there, buried under the layers of guilt and shame, and I was determined to find her again. I didn't see Manfred much after that. We met once for coffee and we talked about the music, about the future, about the things we'd learned. There was no anger between us, no regret, just a quiet acceptance. He told me he was proud of me, proud of the woman I was becoming, and I told him I was grateful for everything he taught me. We didn't kiss, we didn't touch. We just sat across from each other, two people who had once been lovers, and we said goodbye. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, harder even than leaving Mark, because it meant letting go of the fantasy, the dream, the version of myself that had been so intoxicating. But it was the right thing to do, and I knew it. It's been a year now. I'm sitting in a different coffee shop, a different part of town, and I'm writing this story because I need to get it out of my head. I need to remember not to punish myself, but to remind myself of how far I've come. The chipped mug in front of me is the same one from the beginning, or at least it looks the same, and I'm not shaking anymore. My hands are steady, my heart is full, and I'm finally starting to forgive myself. Sophie and Leo are with me on weekends now, and we're building a new kind of family, one that's messy and imperfect but real. Mark is dating someone new, a sweet woman who makes him laugh, and I'm happy for him, truly. It took a long time to get here, but I'm here, and that's what matters. And Manfred, he passed away last month, peacefully in his sleep, with his hands resting on the keys of his beloved Steinway. I went to his funeral, stood in the back of the chapel, and I listened to the music they played in his honor. It was beautiful, haunting, and I cried, not for what we'd lost, but for what we'd gained. He taught me to feel again. He taught me to be brave. He taught me that it's never too late to change, to grow, to become the person you were always meant to be. I'll carry those lessons with me forever. I still play the piano. Every day without fail. I play for myself, for my children, for the memory of a man who changed my life in ways I never could have imagined. I play the music of my past, the music of my present, the music of my future, and I'm not afraid anymore. I'm not afraid to be loud, to be messy, to be human. I'm not afraid of the mistakes I've made because they've made me who I am. I'm not afraid of the future because I know I can handle it. I've been through hell and I've come out the other side, bruised but unbroken. That's the story. It's not a happy one, not really. There's no fairy tale ending, no neatly tied bow, but it's mine and I'm proud of it because I survived. I survived the betrayal, the heartbreak, the shame. I survived losing everything and I found myself in the wreckage. It took an 80-year-old piano teacher to show me that I was worth saving. It took losing my marriage, my home, my sense of self to realize that I was strong enough to rebuild. And I did. I'm doing it every single day, one note at a time. That's the truth, the ugly, beautiful, complicated truth, and I'm finally ready to live it. I thought I was done with the story. I thought I had reached the end, the quiet resolution where the dust settles and you learn to live with the ruins. But life has a cruel way of reminding you that you're never really finished, that the past has a habit of creeping back into the present when you least expect it. It's been 18 months since the divorce, 14 months since Manfred died, and I've been living in a state of careful, fragile equilibrium. My apartment is still small, still cramped, but I've made it my own. I painted the walls a soft sage green, hung photographs of the kids, bought a used upright piano that fits perfectly in the corner of the living room. It's not a Steinway, not even close, but it's mine, and I play it every morning before the chaos of the day begins. I've been seeing a therapist regularly, a no-nonsense woman named Dr. Patel who doesn't let me wallow in self-pity for more than 5 minutes at a time. She's been a godsend, honestly, even though I resisted her at first. I was so used to punishing myself, to marinating in my own guilt, that the idea of moving forward felt like a betrayal of everything I'd done. But she helped me see that I was wrong. That healing isn't about forgetting or excusing. It's about accepting what happened and choosing to live anyway. Sophie and Leo are adjusting as well as can be expected. They spend every other weekend with me, and we've developed a routine that feels almost normal. Friday nights are pizza and movie nights, Saturdays are for the zoo or the park or the children's museum, and Sundays are lazy mornings with pancakes and board games. They don't ask about Manfred anymore. They don't ask about the divorce. They've accepted this new reality with the resilience that only children possess, and I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for their forgiveness, even if I don't always feel like I deserve it. Mark has been more than fair with the custody arrangement, never using the kids as a weapon, never making me feel like a monster when I pick them up. He's moved on truly, and I've made peace with that. His new girlfriend, a pediatric nurse named Rachel, is wonderful with Sophie and Leo, and I can't even bring myself to be jealous. I'm just relieved that they have another loving adult in their lives. It takes a village, right? Even if that village is built on the ashes of a failed marriage. But then a few weeks ago I got a letter. An actual paper letter with a stamp and everything, which feels almost archaic in this digital age. It was addressed to me in handwriting I didn't recognize, a spidery, elegant script that looked like it belonged to another century. I opened it while I was drinking my morning coffee, my hand trembling slightly for no reason I could articulate. The letter was from a lawyer, a firm I'd never heard of, and the contents made my blood run cold. It was about Manfred's estate. I knew he had a daughter, a woman named Helena who lived in Seattle and rarely visited. I'd never met her, never even spoken to her on the phone. Manfred had mentioned her a few times, always with a note of sadness in his voice. They were estranged, had been for years, and he didn't like to talk about it. I assumed she had inherited everything, the studio, the instruments, the mountain of sheet music, the old house he'd lived in for 40 years. But apparently that wasn't the case. The letter informed me that Manfred had left me a significant portion of his estate, including the Steinway grand piano and a substantial sum of money. I read the words over and over, my brain refusing to process them. Why would he do that? Why would he leave anything to me, the woman who had helped destroy his peace of mind in the final years of his life? It didn't make sense. I called the lawyer immediately, a gruff man with a thick New York accent who explained the details with the clinical detachment of someone who deals with death every day. Apparently, Manfred had updated his will shortly after we stopped seeing each other. He'd left me the piano, the studio, and a trust fund that would provide me with a modest but steady income for the rest of my life. The rest of his assets, including the house, went to Helena, but the studio was mine. The Steinway was mine. I didn't know what to say. I sat there in my tiny apartment, staring at the phone, and I felt the tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. He had done this for me. Even after everything, even after I'd pushed him away, even after I'd blamed him for the wreckage of my life, he had still wanted to take care of me. It was a gift I didn't deserve, and it broke my heart all over again. I flew to Seattle for the reading of the will, a formality that I could have skipped but felt compelled to attend. I needed to face Helena, to look her in the eye and explain myself, even if she didn't want to hear it. The law firm was in a sterile high-rise, all glass and chrome, and I felt wildly out of place in my simple dress and flats. Helena was already there when I arrived, a tall, severe woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair and eyes that were the same piercing blue as her father's. She looked at me with undisguised contempt, and I couldn't blame her. "So you're the one," she said, and her voice was cold, "the one who ruined everything." I opened my mouth to defend myself, but nothing came out. She was right. I had ruined things, not just for myself, but for everyone around me. "I'm sorry," I said, and it sounded so inadequate. "I'm so sorry, Helena, I never meant to hurt your father." She scoffed, crossing her arms over her chest. "That's what they all say, you know, he was never the same after you. He stopped playing, did you know that? He used to play every single day and then he just stopped." I felt a knife twist in my gut. I hadn't known. I'd been so consumed with my own pain that I hadn't stopped to think about his. The lawyer read the will in a monotone, the legal jargon washing over me like static. When it was over, Helena stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "I don't want your apologies," she said. "I just want you to leave me alone. Take the piano, take the studio, take whatever he gave you. I don't want any of it." She walked out without looking back, and I sat there in the empty conference room, feeling the weight of her hatred settle on my shoulders. I didn't blame her. If I were in her position, I would have hated me too, but it still hurt more than I expected it to. I'd hoped foolishly that I could make amends somehow, that I could explain myself and she would understand that I wasn't a monster, just a broken woman who had made terrible choices. But she didn't want to understand, and I had to accept that. I flew back to Portland the next day, my mind churning with thoughts of the studio, the piano, the legacy he'd left me. I hadn't been back to that building since the day Mark caught us. The thought of walking up those creaky stairs, of opening that door and seeing the room where I had both fallen in love and lost everything, filled me with a dread I couldn't shake. But I knew I had to go. The studio was mine now, and I couldn't just abandon it. I couldn't let it sit there, gathering dust, a monument to our shared history. So on a gray Tuesday morning, I drove downtown, parked in my old spot, and I walked up the stairs for the first time in over a year. The door was unlocked, which surprised me. I pushed it open slowly, half expecting to see Manfred sitting at the piano, his wild white hair gleaming in the soft yellow light. But the room was empty, save for the instruments and the sheet music and the layers of dust that had settled over everything. The Steinway was still there, a hulking presence in the center of the room, and I walked over to it like a pilgrim approaching a shrine. I ran my fingers over the keys and a soft, discordant sound filled the silence. It was out of tune. Manfred would have hated that. He was always so meticulous about the tuning, so obsessive about every single note. I smiled despite myself and sat down on the bench. The wood was worn smooth from decades of use, and I could feel the ghost of his presence beside me, the echo of his hands on the keys. I started to play. I didn't plan what I was going to play, didn't think about it at all. I just let my fingers wander, and what came out was a melody I'd never heard before, something sad and hopeful and utterly mine. I played for hours, losing track of time, losing track of myself. The sun shifted through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor, and I didn't stop. I played until my fingers ached, until my back was stiff, until the room was dark and I could barely see the keys. And then I sat there in the silence, and I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. This was where I was supposed to be. This was where I was meant to find myself. Not as someone's wife, not as someone's lover, but as Claire, the pianist, the woman who had survived. I started coming to the studio every day. I cleaned it from top to bottom, dusting every surface, organizing the mountains of sheet music, polishing the Steinway until it gleamed. I reconnected with some of Manfred's old students, people who had heard about the will and reached out to offer their condolences. They were kind, understanding, and they didn't judge me for what had happened. They just wanted to keep the music alive, to honor the man who had taught them so much. I started giving lessons, just a few a week at first, then more as word spread. I was good at it, better than I expected. I had Manfred's patience, his ability to see the potential in every student, his gift for pushing people to be their best. It felt like I was carrying on his legacy, like I was paying forward the gift he had given me. But the past has a way of catching up with you no matter how fast you run. Last week, I was at the studio working with a young girl who was struggling with a chop-in piece when I heard footsteps on the stairs. I didn't think anything of it at first. The studio was open to anyone who wanted to come and play, and I often had visitors, former students or curious musicians who had heard about the place. But when the door opened, my heart stopped. It was Mark. He was standing in the doorway, looking older than I remembered, his hair streaked with gray, his face lined with the stress of the past few years. He looked around the room, at the instruments, the photographs, the piano, and then he looked at me. "Hey," he said, and his voice was tentative, uncertain. "I hope it's okay that I came." I stood up, my hands shaking, my heart pounding. "Mark, what are you doing here?" He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I was in the neighborhood," he said, and he gave a weak smile. "That's a lie. I actually came looking for you. I needed to talk." I gestured to the chair in the corner, the one Manfred used to sit in when he was listening to his students play. Mark sat down, and I sat on the piano bench facing him. There was a long silence, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, he spoke. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately," he said, "about us, about what happened, and I realized that I never really gave you a chance to explain." I stared at him, my mouth open. "I didn't think you wanted to hear it," I said. "I didn't think there was any explanation that would make it right." He nodded slowly. "There isn't," he said. "There's no excuse for what you did, but I've been going to therapy too, Claire. I've been trying to understand, and I've realized that I wasn't perfect either. I took you for granted. I stopped seeing you. I put you in a box and I left you there, and I don't know if I would have ever opened it if this hadn't happened." I felt tears welling up in my eyes. "That doesn't justify what I did," I said. "I know," he replied. "It doesn't. But it helps me understand. It helps me forgive you." He looked at me, and there was such tenderness in his eyes, such raw vulnerability, that it took my breath away. "I don't want to get back together," he said quickly, as if anticipating my thoughts. "That's not why I'm here. I'm with Rachel now, and I love her, but I needed you to know that I forgive you. I needed you to know that I don't hate you. And I needed you to know that I'm proud of you for what you've done with this place, with your life. You're not the same person you were, and neither am I." I didn't know what to say. I just sat there, tears streaming down my face, and he stood up and walked over to me. He put his hand on my shoulder, the first time he'd touched me in years, and it was warm and familiar and heartbreaking. "I'll always care about you, Claire," he said. "You gave me my children. You gave me 12 years of my life that I wouldn't trade for anything. And even though it ended badly, I don't regret a single moment." And then he leaned down and kissed my forehead, a gentle, chaste kiss, and he walked out the door. I sat there for a long time after he left, staring at the empty doorway, and I felt something shift inside me. It was like a weight had been lifted, a chain I'd been carrying around my neck for years. He had forgiven me. He had given me the one thing I never thought I'd get, and now it was time for me to forgive myself. I look around the studio now at the photographs of musicians I'll never meet, the sheet music that covers every surface, the Steinway that gleams in the dim light. I think about Manfred, about the last time I saw him, the way he held my hand and told me he was proud of me. I think about Mark, about the way he stood in this very room and told me he forgave me. I think about my children, about the future, about the long road ahead. It's not going to be easy. I know that. There will be more tears, more struggles, more moments of doubt, but I'm ready. For the first time in my life, I'm ready to face whatever comes next because I've already survived the worst. I've already hit rock bottom and crawled my way back up, and I know with absolute certainty that I can handle anything. The story isn't over. It's never really over, is it? But this chapter is closing and I'm ready to start the next one. I'm ready to be the person I was always meant to be, not the person I was running from, not the person I was hiding from. I'm ready to play my own music, loud and proud and unapologetic. I'm ready to live.